Usually when you sit down to play a game of chess, there's like this implicit agreement between the players.
Right, a shared reality.
Exactly. Both people understand the dimensions of the board, they agree on exactly how the pieces move, and, they accept the shared conditions for winning or losing.
Yeah, because even in a really fierce, high-stakes competition, you both fundamentally value the survival of the game itself.
But, what happens when you sit down at the board, you carefully make your opening move, and your opponent responds by just lighting the entire table on fire?
Oh, well, at that point, you certainly aren't playing chess anymore.
Right.
You are dealing with a completely different kind of emergency. The rules go right out the window.
And that is exactly the psychological framework being built in today's source material. Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone.
Glad you're joining us.
Yeah, so today we're unpacking an excerpt from a Fox News YouTube video transcript. It's titled, Levin, Iranian regime rejects the legitimacy of the West.
It's a really intense piece of media.
It is. And to be crystal clear right out of the gate for you listening, our mission today is to pull back the curtain on how political persuasion actually works.
Absolutely.
Because this text makes highly politically charged claims. It touches on U.S. administrations, international relations, the Middle East, deeply held religious beliefs. It covers a lot of ground.
It's sweeping.
Yeah. So we aren't here to cheerlead these viewpoints, and we aren't here to condemn them either. We are here as impartial analysts. We want to dissect the architecture of the argument and, understand the underlying mechanics of how this speaker is attempting to persuade the audience.
And that is really the only way to truly digest this kind of media. Because if you just skim the surface, you just get lost in the emotional intensity of it.
Totally.
To understand this text, you have to look at how the speaker fundamentally frames international diplomacy. They don't see it as a series of negotiations.
Right. It's not the chess match.
Exactly. It's not a chess match with an irritating opponent. They frame it as an absolute existential fight for human survival.
Okay, let's unpack this because the text starts off incredibly heavy.
It really does.
The speaker immediately deploys two massive historical quotes at the very top of the transcript.
Yep.
First, they quote Ronald Reagan, warning that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction, and that it has to be fought for constantly.
A huge rhetorical swing right there.
And then they drop in this grim prediction attributed to Albert Einstein, saying that while we don't know what weapons World War III will be fought with, World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.
Right, explicitly referencing the threat of the nuclear age.
Yeah. So, why choose those two figures specifically to open the video?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's a calculated rhetorical anger.
Okay.
You have Ronald Reagan, who, for this audience, represents the ultimate political patron saint of the Cold War.
Right.
A time defined by a stark binary struggle between freedom and totalitarianism. And then you have Albert Einstein, who is arguably the ultimate scientific authority on the catastrophic reality of nuclear weapons.
Right. So you've got the political weight and the scientific weight.
Exactly. By fusing them together right at the beginning, the speaker is essentially telling the listener, you are not about to hear a boring policy debate. You are stepping onto the precipice of global annihilation.
Which, that makes sense when you look at what the speaker's actually reacting to later in the text.
Yeah.
Because they mention a, quote, tentative deal on the table with 60 days to debate, discuss, negotiate down the road.
Bureaucracy.
Right. That sounds like the most mundane, standard issue government bureaucracy imaginable.
Exactly. It sounds like paperwork. And that is exactly what the speaker is trying to combat.
Interesting.
By contrasting a 60-day bureaucratic timeline with quotes about the extinction of freedom and global nuclear devastation, the speaker structurally elevates the discussion.
So it's not about the 60 days anymore.
No, the text explicitly calls this a war between civilization and barbarism. If you successfully frame the situation as a burning building, the very idea of sitting down for a 60-day debate about the temperature of the flames seems utterly absurd.
It's like trying to discuss local zoning laws while a meteor is hurtling toward Earth.
Yes.
But, treating diplomacy like a meteor strike only really works if the other side is actually a meteor.
Right.
How does the speaker prove that the adversary fundamentally cannot be reasoned with?
Well, this is where the text transitions from the historical stakes to the ideological barrier.
Okay.
The speaker makes incredibly specific, unyielding claims about the Iranian regime's worldview. They argue that their ideology demands the world's population must convert or comply, be conquered or eliminated.
Wow. Right. The text states that the regime completely rejects the Judeo-Christian belief system and like the overall legitimacy of the West.
Exactly.
But here is where I want to pause and push back on the text a little bit, or at least just get some clarity.
Sure.
Because the source drops a reference to a belief in the 12th, but it doesn't really explain it.
Right.
If the source claims the regime has violated every single agreement over the last 47 years because their constitution mandates expanding Islamist governments, what is the alternative being proposed? Is the speaker saying diplomacy itself is a flaw? And what does this 12th thing actually mean in this context?
It's a critical piece of the puzzle for understanding their argument.
Okay.
When the text mentions the 12th, it's referring to the 12th Imam in 12er Shia eschatology.
Eschatology, meaning like the end of the world.
Exactly. It's a central messianic figure prophesied to return and bring ultimate justice to the world.
Oh, wow.
So by invoking this, the speaker isn't just saying the regime is deeply religious. They are arguing that the regime is operating on an apocalyptic end times timeline.
Okay. So it's not just about governing a country for them. It's about fulfilling a prophecy.
Precisely. The text asserts that because the regime views their revolution as belonging literally to Allah, any suppression of those revolutionary ideals, like through a diplomatic treaty, isn't just a military or political loss.
It's a religious loss.
It's an existential theological failure.
That's fascinating.
The source argues they literally cannot tolerate dissent or compromise because to do so would be to attack their own divine mandate.
So a compromise on, say, a nuclear deal isn't just a bad trade. According to this rhetoric, it is a spiritual betrayal.
Yes. And look at the structural contrast the text uses to highlight why diplomacy fails.
Okay.
Think about the Western system of government. A democracy essentially mandates a regime change every few years through elections, right?
We swap out presidents.
We intentionally cycle through leaders to avoid permanent rule. But the source argues that the Iranian regime operates on the exact opposite principle. They are seeking a permanent totalitarian state.
Okay, I see where this is going.
You cannot negotiate a temporary 4-year pause with an entity that believes it is on a permanent, divinely ordained mission.
Wow. It's like trying to sync a clock that resets every 4 minutes with a calendar that measures time in centuries.
Yes.
The gears just don't mesh.
That's a perfect way to visualize it.
Yeah.
The underlying logic of the text is that diplomacy itself is a fatal flaw when dealing with this specific adversary, because the shared reality required for negotiations simply does not exist.
But, ideological fervor alone doesn't really explain the immediate panic in this text.
Right.
I mean, a radical ideology is only a real pressing threat if it has the physical machinery to execute its goals.
Which is where the speaker logically shifts from theology to ballistics.
Right, because the source argues that since the regime will never change its ideology, any financial relief gained from these diplomatic negotiations won't be used to feed everyday citizens.
No.
It will directly fund physical violence.
The rhetoric moves out of the abstract and gets very visceral here.
It really does. I mean, the text runs through a harrowing list of internal human rights abuses.
Yep.
Specifically mentioning the brutal treatment of women and the gay community, massive torture, rape, and public executions by the tens of thousands.
It's incredibly heavy.
And then it pivots outward.
Yeah.
Right. Labeling the regime the mothership and ground zero for terror proxies like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Muslim Brotherhood.
What's fascinating here is the specific detail the speaker zeroes in on as a massive media blind spot.
Oh, the footnote thing.
Exactly. They call it a footnote that is ignored in all the news reports, and that is ballistic missiles.
Right.
The source warns of thousands of missiles capable of reaching Paris, London, and eventually the United States.
It's a deliberate escalation of the geographic threat. They're making it a global issue.
And they point out Hezbollah making northern Israel uninhabitable, noting that Israel is our closest ally and just cannot tolerate agreements without real physical protections.
So what does this all mean? The speaker brings up this comparison to the U.S. border to drive it home.
Yeah.
The source asks the audience to imagine if Mexico were raining missiles down on Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And they state emphatically that we wouldn't put up with it for 1 second.
We definitely wouldn't.
Right. How does this hypothetical serve to rally the listener against the current diplomatic approach. Why is this such an effective tool?
Well, it overcomes a massive cognitive hurdle called psychological distance.
Psychological distance.
Yeah. Human brains are terrible at processing threats that are geographically far away or culturally unfamiliar.
Sure.
The geopolitical dynamics between Israel, Iran, and Lebanon are incredibly complex, and for an American audience, happening thousands of miles away.
Right. It's really easy for the brain to file that under someone else's problem.
Exactly. But by transplanting that exact kinetic scenario onto the U.S.-Mexico border, the speaker bypasses all of that geopolitical complexity. They hack directly into the listener's amygdala.
The fear center of the brain.
Right. It's a rhetorical technique called domestication.
Domestication.
Yeah.
I like that.
It forces you to instantly feel the vulnerability that the text claims Israel is experiencing.
Wow.
Suddenly, the argument against diplomatic leniency doesn't require a degree in international relations, It just feels like common sense self-defense.
It completely bridges the gap between abstract foreign policy and the listener's own backyard.
Totally.
So once the listener's amygdala is fully hijacked, where does the speaker direct all of that fear and energy?
Right into domestic politics.
Because having established this existential threat, the immovable ideology, and the physical reality of the missiles, the final logical step in this argument's architecture is assigning blame and praise to the American political figures handling it.
Exactly. This is where the text weaponizes foreign policy to enforce domestic loyalty. The partisan lines drawn here are absolute.
They really are.
Yeah.
I mean, the source directly accuses past presidents, specifically naming Biden and Obama, of actually funding the enemy and laying the groundwork for them to get nuclear missiles.
That is an incredibly severe accusation.
It really is. It goes on to say that Democrats, the media, and so-called isolationists are literally standing with the enemy and giving them aid and comfort.
Yep.
But on the flip side, President Trump is heavily praised. He's called a courageous, moral man who uniquely confronted this threat, even when it cost him politically, like during midterm elections or, dealing with high gas prices.
Right. And Benjamin Netanyahu is also singled out as a great leader and the only ally truly willing to fight beside the U.S.
So here's where it gets really interesting to me. It seems so counterintuitive.
What's that?
Well, in the middle of constructing this partisan bunker, the source explicitly states they know they will be called a warmonger or an unpatriotic Jew, but they're willing to stake their reputation on the claim that the regime will just outlast the Trump administration or a Republican Congress. By acknowledging the criticism in advance, how is the speaker trying to inoculate their audience against opposing viewpoints? Like, why voluntarily remind your audience of the worst things your critics say about you?
This raises an important question, right? You would think it's giving oxygen to the haters.
Exactly.
But it is actually one of the most powerful psychological defense mechanisms in persuasion. It is a textbook application of inoculation theory.
Inoculation theory. Okay, break that down for me.
Think about how a literal vaccine works in the human body.
You introduce a weakened version of the virus so your immune system knows how to fight the real thing later.
Exactly. The speaker is doing the exact same thing, but with ideas.
Oh, wow.
By predicting the exact attacks their critics will use, calling them a warmonger, attacking their faith, the speaker introduces a weakened version of the counterargument.
Right.
They effectively defang those criticisms before the opposition even has a chance to speak.
That is wild. So when the audience inevitably hears someone on another network call this commentator a warmonger later that day, they won't think, oh, maybe this speaker's too aggressive.
No, they'll think, the speaker warned me you would say exactly this to try and silence the truth.
It's a trap.
It is. It doesn't just block the criticism, it actively builds massive, almost impenetrable trust between the speaker and the listener. It proves the speaker's foresight.
That is brilliant. And honestly, slightly terrifying.
It's very effective. And the speaker uses this intense domestic polarization to heighten the urgency of the whole message.
How so?
They reframe the rejection of diplomatic deals so it's no longer just a stance on foreign policy. The text elevates it to a profound, inescapable moral responsibility to our children, our grandchildren, and to civilization itself.
Right. They compare the necessary sacrifice to past generations who ensured a free society. like the World War II generation.
Exactly. It places the listener directly into the continuum of history. If you accept the speaker's premises, walking away from diplomacy isn't warmongering, it's a heroic duty.
Which brings us full circle perfectly.
It does.
So let's quickly review the architecture of the argument we've mapped out today in this deep dive into the source material. It's really a masterclass in structural persuasion.
It really is a tightly constructed sequence.
First, the text establishes the absolute highest existential stakes right out of the gate using Reagan and Einstein.
Right, setting up extinction versus freedom.
Exactly, making standard diplomacy look ridiculous. Second, it defines the enemy's ideology through things like the 12th Imam as fundamentally theologically incompatible with compromise.
They cannot be negotiated with.
Right. Third, it lists the terrifying physical threats of terror proxies and ballistic missiles, utilizing that U.S.-Mexico border analogy to hack the listener's psychological distance.
The domestication of the threat.
Yes. And finally, it uses inoculation theory to defend itself while ruthlessly condemning or highly praising U.S. leaders based entirely on their willingness to accept this uncompromising worldview.
By the time the listener reaches the end of the transcript, the structural logic leaves them feeling that to even entertain the idea of diplomacy is to knowingly invite their own destruction.
For you, the listener, why does spending time analyzing this matter?
That's the big question.
Right. Whether you firmly agree with the politics of this commentator, or whether you fundamentally oppose everything they stand for, understanding how this argument is built is your best defense against being passively manipulated.
Absolutely.
Seeing how media figures weave historical quotes, eschatology, psychological distance, and raw fear together is an essential skill for navigating today's information landscape.
Yep.
If you can see the architecture of the argument, you can evaluate the information critically without just getting swept away by the intense emotional current.
I completely agree. And, if we step back from the specific politics of this text, there's a really profound underlying tension here to mull over before we go.
Well, that's that.
The source highlights a massive structural asymmetry in how different nations experience time.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
On one hand, you have a Western democracy, a system that inherently changes its administration, its priorities, and its foreign policy posture every 4 to 8 years.
Right, the 4-minute clock.
Exactly. On the other hand, the text describes a regime operating on a permanent, supposedly divinely favored ideological timeline. They view history in terms of ultimate prophecy, not election cycles.
The calendar measuring centuries.
Right. So it raises a fascinating, much broader question for the modern world. How can a constantly shifting, self-correcting democracy ever successfully negotiate with or contain an adversary that measures its victories and defeats in centuries rather than election cycles?
Oh, wow. That is quite the thought to end on. Goes right back to the beginning. It is incredibly hard to play chess when your opponent isn't just playing a different game. They are operating in a completely different reality, on a completely different timeline.
Exactly.
And if the board is on fire, the standard rules of engagement just don't apply anymore. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Remember, the goal isn't just to consume the information you hear, but to dissect it. Keep looking for the architecture of the arguments around you and keep questioning. We'll catch you next time.